a number of years. We met together in Ukraine, in Crimea, where Praxis was holding a ecological Marxist conference at a and so Britain, based in Oxford, England, he came and joined us as an economist and as an eco-socialist, and we've met several times afterwards at meetings of an international eco-socialist network.
That's right.
David is always or also part of.
Yes.
That has founding conventions every year or two and never seems to do anything. But
Yeah.
the people are great people. And we were just talking about Richard Smith, whose
Yes.
books we've been discussing here.
Right.
So you're among familiars, and I'm so happy that you were free today and were willing to join us, because today we're just trying to approach the rather chilling topic of racism and sectarianism
Right.
and nationalism.
Right. Right.
Reactionary religions.
Yes.
And all of these identity problems that have made it so difficult to imagine world uniting of people together to overcome capitalism and create a safe and cooperative world.
Yeah.
So you have experience going back many, many years in the movement in India.
Yeah.
You're the only person that I ever heard make sense of the question. So that's why I wanted you to be with us, and I hope stay, because this is an imaginative process that we're doing together that's very much in line with your own thinking. And normally Alexei is with us.
Okay.
And other people.
Yeah.
So, the rest of you just say hello and say your names and introduce yourselves to Pritam Singh.
And let me say that I'm very pleased to be able to join you, and thank you for inviting me, and it's a pleasure. So I look forward to hearing other comrades introducing themselves.
Okay, I'll start. I'm Fred Murphy. I'm actually in San Francisco today, but I'm usually in New York City, where I've been working with the Marxist Education Project. I've been a socialist of one sort or another for about 40 years. And I work mostly on issues of the environment and Marxism and science and nature. And I've been working closely with Richard on this project, managing.
Oh, great. Yeah.
Managing the wiki, the website that we have, futurehistorians.org, and the Zoom sessions and our Dropbox files and all of the technological ancillary
Great,
stuff.
Fred. Yeah.
Good morning. Glad to have you. David.
Oh, yes. Greetings. Let me just ask a quick question. The meeting in the Crimea, Richard, that you mentioned, was that the one I was at too?
I think I had a memory loss. I think Pritam, we met was it in Moscow or in Kiev or in Crimea?
Well, David, I know you. I don't know where. I met you.
You did. I have a terrible memory.
Maybe at Historical Materialism.
You do look
I think we met at Historical Materialism Conference in London also.
Oh, really? Yes. My last name is Schwartzman, and I live in a so-called belly of the beast, in D.C.
Okay.
And actually, I'm running for office for the final time.
Okay.
I'm sure it's going to be the final time for the D.C. Council.
Okay.
On an eco-socialist perspective, with an eco-socialist point of view. So my slogan I borrowed from Jeremy Corbyn, for the many, not the few. And I'm going to use that in my campaign, for truly affordable housing, for income support. We have terrible disparities in D.C., actually bigger than any other many respects bigger than any other city in the U.S. So it's both a challenge and an opportunity. So
Great.
I mean, I don't think I'll need to say more, but I'm an eco-socialist. I'm actually a biogeochemist who's retired from Howard University in 2012, but I'm still very active in both political and scientific field, especially with my oldest son, who is, we're coming out with a book soon. So that's all I'll say. But
excellent.
Great
Excellent.
to have you.
Yeah, thank you.
Conrad.
Hi, I'm Conrad Hamilton. I live in Paris at this time, but I'm originally from Canada. And at the moment, I'm teaching and pursuing a doctorate in philosophy, Marxist philosophy, at Paris 8 University, Saint-Denis in Paris. Okay. And I work with Catherine Malibu and Pierre Caso-Nuguez on a project of trying to interpret Marx and to explore the potential for the recognition of natural and technological agencies.
Right. Great. Wonderful topic. Yes.
Sam.
Hi.
Sam Fassbender, you want to introduce yourself? I think you're.
I was muted.
You were making a lot of noise there. I muted you.
Well, okay. It's morning here.
Yes.
My name is Sam. The book will come out under my name, Samuel Day Fassbender. It will be called Utopian Dreaming and Climate Change, and I am currently trying to use most of my spare time, whatever that is, to put out a chapter on Paulo Freire.
Right.
I might not be able to stay incredibly long for this conference because I'll be going downstairs to cook breakfast for my 81-year-old mom who needs a little bit of quiet time in order to relax her brain.
Sure.
So we'll see how this goes.
Where are you speaking from?
Claremont, California, in Southern California.
Right. Great. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Yeah. So carry on. And
I just wanted to have the floor to ask and once again beg Sam to please, if you're not afraid that we will plagiarize it, would you share some of your book sounds so important and so much part of this, and I just wish that you'd share some of your work with us.
Well,
you're asking.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's a chapter somewhat near completion right now called Aldous Huxley and Education, and you could take a look at that at some point.
Will you send it to us or put it in the Dropbox?
Well, let's see. Let's go to Gmail here. And where's the, let's see, future historians. You want, I guess we could just go with reply to all.
Yeah.
And then, let's see, where's the attachment thing? Here we go. All right, there it is, gang.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Sam. While I've got you, because I'm an old salesman, what about giving us a peek?
Did it show up?
Yes, I just got it.
Computer?
Yep, I'm going to forward it to Pritam because he's not on our list. Yeah, we will.
Okay, thank you.
Your email accounts?
Yeah.
Yep.
Sam,
Yeah.
could you also?
Hey, gang, just to interrupt Richard here. Sorry, Richard. I'm still looking for a place where this could be published. I guess there's a publication called Utopian Studies. I was thinking maybe I could send it to them. I don't know.
Good place to start. They seem to have a presence online too, or no, there's one of the H groups. There's a H Utopia. You know, the HNet,
No idea.
I'll send you a link to that later. I was just going to mention, I got an email from Alexei. He will be joining us in about 40 minutes.
Oh, great.
Wonderful. He has to get back to his home, I guess. So, Richard, you want to?
I was just going to finish it's asking Sam if it would be possible to take a peek at your foreword or preface or introduction, just to have some general idea, because the concepts together go so well.
Okay, well,
we did have some chapters a few months ago, I know.
Yeah, I sent you all the Marx chapter, Marx and Future Studies chapter.
Right, which we loved.
Okay.
And discussed.
Right, the general idea here will be to pose everything in the frames of fantasy and reality, and that the narrative of science is generally concerned with realism, okay, and sometimes this becomes pompous realism because it becomes rather oblivious to the fantasy frame in which it is being conducted, and tends to criticize other versions of science as based on fantasy, whereas fantasy is inescapable. And so with the initial chapter, which you can read on in Knowledge Cultures, I discuss how current efforts, or current mainstream, I should say, efforts at climate change mitigation are based on the fantasy of money and commodities and property, as discussed in the first chapter of Volume 1 of Capital, right? And so my suggestion, of course, is that what we need is climate change mitigation that would be based on a different fantasy, in which, which would be a utopian dream, a dream of utopia in which physical climate change mitigation were possible, okay? What we have now is fantasy climate change mitigation, in which the corporations all imagine that if they do X number of green things, it will all somehow magically amount to climate change mitigation. And of course, it's not going to work, right? And the big 800-pound gorilla in the room, which nobody is discussing, is the fossil fuel industries, which need to be phased out. If they were really serious, okay, here would be a possible serious plan for climate change mitigation. Have the US government start a car company. Have the car company produce nothing but electric and veggie oil, vehicles of every sort, every sort that people currently use. Give people the current amount of time to exchange their current vehicles for brand new electric or veggie oil vehicles, right? Free of charge, right? To anyone who has a vehicle. Okay, after a certain amount of time, you shut off the gas pumps. And by shutting off the gas pumps, I mean shut them all off. Okay, there. And then repeat this process for every other use of fossil fuels.
Sam, you just
shut down the fossil fuel industry.
Sam, all that goes under the topic of how, and it would be great to have a few paragraphs writing that narrative for our wiki.
Look, gang, I'll send you a copy of the web address to the climate change mitigation in fantasy and reality piece, and the password. You'll need to open it. I mean, I think I've done this already, but I'll do it again.
Right.
Oh, I'm dying to read it. Thanks, Sam. And I agree with Fred. You've got so many wonderful fantasies, and we need to work out a way where'd
it go?
We take advantage of it, and that it goes up on the wiki, and we start filling in all of the different stories of how the world might change, precisely through fantasy.
Yeah. Can I intervene here?
Please.
Can I say something here?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I like your ideas, Sam. I would put it slightly differently. I would like to frame it as transition to eco-socialism. And why I say transition to eco-socialism? Because in the revolutionary Marxist movement, there is a view that whenever you suggest any reforms under capitalism, you are just dismissed as a reformist. And the idea is that whether it's a question of racial discrimination or gender injustice or environmental destruction, unless capitalism is abolished, all these things cannot be done. And yes, that utopia is inspiring, but at the same time, one needs to know what has to be done now. Is there anything which can be done within the confine of a capitalist economy, within the confine of a patriarchal structures of society, within the confines of racial tensions, and so on and so forth? And I am trying to develop eco-socialist theory of reforms under capitalism, which are building blocks for eco-socialism. And in order to make my point clear, if it can be made clear, I would say that like democratic reforms under capitalism are essential to build democratic socialism. Similarly, green economic reforms under capitalism also are very essential to build the foundations for eco-socialism. So you cannot build a democratic socialism in a society which is undemocratic. And that is a big experience, a big conclusion one can draw from the Russian experience. A highly authoritarian bureaucratic society, you build socialism on it, it degenerates very soon and becomes totalitarian. Similarly, I would say that even if it is possible that there is a revolution in America or Germany or wherever, but if the economy is on green, you will not be able to build a green socialism, eco-socialism on that. So therefore, it is important now to start thinking about proposing yourself, struggling for that, negotiating for reforms, whether these reforms are in the domain of reducing fossil fuel use, whether these reforms are in the domain of transport network, reducing car use, increasing cycling, or it is in the domain of housing construction, energy efficiency, and so on and so forth. So I do not dismiss reforms under capitalism as something reformist politics. For me, that's a part of the revolutionary transition. And if it means that some corporations are doing it for their own interests, like corporations who might be building solar panels, and they might be doing purely for profit motive, let them do it. I have no objection to that. They might be doing it because they have their own logic of profit maximization. But the fact that they're producing solar panels, which are then going to be used to reduce the emissions, I would think that is a positive thing. So I would kind of try to combine the utopia with the practical. One can have hundreds of those examples. What I would say is the path of transition to eco-socialism.
May I respond?
Yes.
Yeah, Sam, go ahead, and then David wanted to say something also.
Okay, because this was addressed to me. I mean, is Pratap?
Pritam.
Pritam. Okay.
Yes.
Pritam.
Yeah.
Excuse me. It's morning. Anyway, the idea behind the focusing the book on utopian dreaming, all right, is that all of the basic ideas of reform and of capitalism are, in the estimation of the book, based on various utopian dreams. Okay, that in this era, there isn't really so much of an self-consciousness about utopian dreaming, because utopian dreaming is not part of the dominant realism of this age. But there was an era in which it was, and I call this the era of utopian dreaming, and it stretches more or less from the Enlightenment to the 1970s. And so, for instance, concepts such as progress and development, which are currently used, right, in a lot of places still, are based on utopian dreams. So you might ask, progress towards what, or development towards what? In that idea of doing something, okay, one way or the other, whether it be reformist or revolutionary, is still in any case based on a precondition of the utopian dream. The utopian dream comes before we start talking about whatever it is we want to do. You know, we might set up solar panels in the utopian dream of a utopia of sustainability, for instance. You know, a society which in its most utopic phase would be immune from ecological collapse, right? This is a utopian dream, at least from our perspective. At any rate, so that's the sense in which I mean utopian dream. And I mean, I think it's probably the same sense is in what you're talking about as well, that, you know, whatever it is we're planning to do would be infused with, in a historic sense, some utopian dream of development or sustainability or progress. And that, so I'm merely going back and jumping up a meta level on the discussion you've suggested, which is of course quite lively, you know, and has a lot of participants, and asking, well, okay, which utopian dream guides the whole effort? I'm, you know, the utopian dream of eco-capitalism, wherein we can create a sustainable society while leaving capitalism intact, needs to be, you know, addressed as, well, okay, there's stodgy realists, or pompous realists as I call them, who really like this dream, but their pomposity seems to be based on an adherence to the political and economic status quo, and an assumption that it's eternal, right? That capitalism will simply last forever, right? Whereas, you know, in the same sense in which the Roman Catholic Church of the 13th century thought feudalism would last forever. So,
Sure.
Okay, so that's kind of how I view it.
Yeah. But my little sort of different take on that would be that, yes, if someone talks about eco-capitalism, I'm willing to engage in a discussion with them rather than say that fuck off, because you are talking about making adjustment within capitalism itself. Because if they are talking about ecological reforms under capitalism, I do want to have a negotiation and discussion with them. What kind of ecological reform? What kind of eco reforms? Because for me, greening capitalism is important. But that does not mean that you accept the inevitability of capitalism forever staying. Because it's like saying that democratic capitalism is obviously far superior to fascism. Both are forms of capitalism. Okay, and you would fight for democratic reforms under capitalism precisely because the socialism which you want to build is also democratic. So I would think that if someone is saying that, you know, we have the vision or we have the utopia of eco-capitalism, I would say, okay, let's have discussion. Let's talk about it. Maybe there are certain things we can sort out, and maybe we cannot sort out. But I would not condemn them as enemies. I would condemn those as enemies who think climate change is a hoax and all that is rubbish. We don't need to do anything about ecology.
David, join us in this.
Yes, this is a very interesting discussion, and it's off the topic of what we were supposed to discuss. So
yes,
yeah. Carry on if you want to go back to the topic. I entered late,
I just want to say a little bit in response, because I appreciate both of what you said, and you know, Lenin made a very important point. We ought to dream. That's in What Is to Be Done. And actually, Ernst Bloch elaborated on that in the Principle of Hope. He actually quoted that. And so this, the dreaming, which Sam is referring to, is absolutely essential. This is dreaming in our minds of what's the other world that is possible. And so I appreciate that point. But as Pritam emphasized, climate mitigation, we have to fight for it now under capitalism, and And again, to reload Lenin, we need to utilize divisions among capital to make that possible. So that's implementing a strategy that I think is essential. It is essential to eco-socialist practice, theory and practice, because if we don't have a strategy, we're just left in a position of fantasy, not converted into reality. Because, we could always keep on saying, repeat over and over again, that socialism has to replace capitalism. Okay, good. But what is the strategy concretely in today's world to make that possible? And I think we need a lot more attention to that. I mean, I think of eco-socialists should engage in producing a global Green New Deal. And not that we'll be necessarily successful, but to use those coalitions and so on to accelerate whatever efforts there are for creating renewable energy. Because as Sam said, okay, you create all of these electric cars and then turn off the gas pump. But where's the electricity going to come from to power the electric cars? It's much better actually to power public transit rather than electric cars, but I get the point. And so I just wanted to, interject those thoughts. So we need to curb carbon emissions in climate mitigation and at the same time accelerate the building of wind and solar. And that's actually this, my oldest son and I discussed this in much more detail in our forthcoming book, which we're right at the point of doing the proofs. So, so I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Could I just jump in on this? I'd like to encourage you, Dave, to elaborate a little bit that idea of a strategy of making a break within the ruling classes between the petroleum complex that you've so well described. What is the other section of the ruling classes that the masses of working people might ally with, and in the hope of having some progress against increasing climate change, while we're developing a movement to overthrow capitalism and end entirely with this? So, and could you write that out? And maybe in the form of a little story, which we could put up in the how, okay? And the same with Sam. And I'd just like to say something about our project right now. Fred and I, mostly Fred, have been working on trying to bring order into the wiki and into all of these different categories that we discuss. And there is something now that explains it. And it's called Explanation of the Grid. Is that it?
Guide to the Grid. It's in the main folder under class topics.
Guide to the Grid. Okay. And the grid is that we've got many, many different areas where we talk about problems and solutions. Ecology is one big one. Economy is another one. And now we're talking about nationalism and internationalism. So they go from the past through the present into the future. And then we have a vertical grid of now, then, and how. That is to say, our wonderful utopian society, the terrible capitalist society, and the different movements, the strategies, like I'm encouraging David and Sam to write up a little bit, ways that might get us from one place to the other. And so this grid is like a patchwork, and we can put various little things into those patches. So it isn't an either-or situation where a bunch of us old Marxists and other radicals argue, no, it's got to be this way, no, it's got to be that way, it's got to be reform, no, it's got to be armed insurrection. No. To the extent that they're within the parameters of our overall philosophy, we put them all in this patchwork. And so it becomes richer. And I think that the more I hear, Sam, about your approach, the more it seems compatible with this. So I'm eager to read your stuff.
Where do we go from here this morning? Should we go back to
well,
the topic at
okay,
hand?
may I respond just a second here?
Sam, sure, go ahead.
Okay, my approach is really, I'm really mostly interested here in this juxtaposition of fantasy and reality as it pertains to real life description of what's going on and you know, programmatic suggestion of what to do, in that, you know, when we discuss how we're going to do it, we have this underlying utopian fantasy that has injected itself into our discourse of description and of suggestion, you know, that dates from the era of utopian dreaming, and that includes terms such as development and progress and other such terms which may not on the surface seem utopian, but have that little utopian idea folded into them. And that's, I mean, you know, I'm trying to use this as a basis for self-examination, really. And that's where my approach is really focused, is in creating some kind of basis for self-examination. Okay, I'll shut up.
Now to the bad side of things. We're supposed to be talking about nationalism, racism, prejudice, horrible internecine warfares, working people slaughtering each other under the name of every kind of reactionary abstraction, and all of this in a situation where nation states are encouraging them and arming them and profiting from all of this. How are we going to get around this? Are there people, I suggested in an email that we try to think of some examples of situations that might develop, of some things under how. But I would like to begin, since I have posted the most stuff, and I basically all the things that I did post there, because I've been thinking about this for years, is that I think that we need, those of us that are Marxists and have followed Leninist ideas, really need to re-examine what was known in the 19th century as the national question. And the idea that the creation of nation states had something to do with the creation of democracy comes from the 1848 revolutions and seemed like a perfect fit, except that the history of the last century has shown us that it's not at all like that, and that there is less and less democracy in those nation states that did once establish it, and that we live now in a nation state system which has dehumanized everyone who is not properly registered as a member of one or another nation states. So that within 3 generations, when I think of my grandparents, who were Europeans and who wandered through various parts of Eastern Europe with their trades and so on, I should say my great-grandparents, their passports didn't exist. They all spoke 3 or 4 different languages. And this fetish of the nation state was not being imposed. And then flash forward, and there's the refugee crises of today, but they go back to the Jews in World War II, and they go back to even further. And it seems to me that there's a big split. The idea that many of us believed in the after World War II and after World War I, of the right of people to self-determination, and that would mean the creation of new states, new nation states. All of that has turned to ashes. The original example, 1916, that inspired Lenin, of the Irish uprising. Well, all of our hearts beat to the Irish uprising and to Connolly, the socialist, who was at the heart of it. And Lenin was certainly not wrong to say that it struck a good blow against Britain in the middle of the imperialist war, and that if these kinds of revolts continued, it would weaken the imperialist system and help the world revolution emerge. So it was supposed to be just, a kickstart, and that was his idea in Russia too, for that matter, that a pre-capitalist country could break the chain of imperialism and open up the possibility for the world proletariat to join it. So he linked the national question of self-determination and with these anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist struggles. But unfortunately, the results were not what he expected. The world revolution did not materialize. It sputtered in 1919. And so these newly created states were kind of frozen in place and just became lines on the ground for the next war. And this was particularly true when the Sacs, the Picos, the pact, the secret pact that Britain and France carved up the Middle East, and many of the other solutions, including the one in India and all over Africa at the end of World War II. And again, the people that I looked up to, my teachers like Raya Dunayevskaya, we were all celebrating and I was part of the Algerian movement for national liberation, but it was the army that took over. And even where nonviolent means were used, as in India, the results have been uniformly disastrous. That the creation of nation states could lead to democracy, could lead to toleration, could lead to the respect for the rights of individuals. So as far as I'm concerned, the nation is what Marx and Engels suggested it was in 1848. Special bodies of armed men. Well, we get armed women too. Prisons, judges, etc. That is to say that the state is more and more reduced to the armed might of the ruling class to keep the status quo. And although government and state have long been identified among us in the so-called democracies, and government does bring good things, there's less and less democracy, less and less government, and everybody is moving towards reactionary populist nationalism. It's just and every new state that gets created crushes a minority within it, or even a majority, as in the case of Israel, which is the most shameful, promising to the Jews a place to stand, and instead of taking away the property of the Palestinians. So that was my big, I suppose, deviation from the Leninist school in which I was raised. And I brought it up because Peter Hudis had written such an interesting paper. And I thought he would be here, but unfortunately he has another meeting. But I just wanted to lay that out, if in case it inspires anyone to discuss it.
Yeah, Richard, I think what you're arguing is that, the hybrid formulation of nation-state is the essence of that, again, is the bodies of armed men and the repressive apparatuses. And to the extent that in order to achieve a buy-in or support for the state, or in order to achieve hegemony over a population, the state may indeed, make concessions and enable welfare state type formations, but those are always contingent and accidental and arise as a result of mass pressure and mass organization outside the framework of the state. And to the extent that that does not persist and be maintained, then states fall back into what is their essential character, which is one of the repressive apparatus to defend and circumscribe the capitalist social order. So, I think I agree basically with that approach. I would just, I still would like to see us discuss further the distinction between the nationalism or the national sentiments of the oppressed, people who are oppressed by imperialism, or as opposed to the nationalism of the oppressor nation. I mean, like the white, in the United States today, white supremacism that we see among a good number of Trump supporters is definitely a form of very evil, insidious nationalism, American nationalism. On the other hand, if we see resistance to that among African American people, that may take the form, has taken the form at certain historical moments of a nationalism of the oppressed that has some positive features and enables. But at the same time, the risk is, and the reality has been, that that nationalism among the oppressed can take unproductive forms, and Pritam can probably tell us more about that in the Indian case, where the struggles for social progress and solidarity among different national and ethnic groupings that are fighting their own particular forms of oppression, that may override the broader solidarity that's required to actually combat oppression on a more global level.
Yeah, sure. I mean, both of you made very important points. And I want to kind of start from Fred's distinction between nationalism of the oppressed people and nationalism of the oppressor people. And that is particularly relevant in the case of imperialism. Because if we were to reject nationalism altogether as a bourgeois ideology, as a reactionary ideology, we will not understand the historical importance of struggles for national liberation, whether in India or in Algeria and other places, where there were people in India also who would say that the struggle for national independence, and of course Gandhi's role is exaggerated. He was one of the participants, and that is to do with the character of the state which emerged in India. But Gandhi and Nehru are appreciated more than many others, and I have been doing work that how they have been competing claims, and one of them is a revolutionary Bhagat Singh, who was a socialist, and at one stage he was actually more popular than Gandhi, but that doesn't suit the ideology of the Indian state, and he was hanged by the British. But the question is that suppose there was a national liberation struggle, even if it's not socialist, it's even bourgeois or the Gandhian, Nehru variety. Would one say that all this is rubbish because this is bourgeois ideology? Or one would say that, no, in the conjuncture in which it's placed, it's a progressive struggle. We know that there are limitations of this struggle, but this is progressive because it's fighting against imperialism. It's going to weaken British imperialism. Similarly, one could say about Algeria and other places. And weakening imperialism is weakening capitalism. So I would still think that the the national liberation struggles under the name of national independence fought in colonies were a progressive nationalism. We don't need to debunk them. But then, and that's slightly different from, Fred, what you were saying, that within America there is nationalism or the white supremacist group and the nationalism of the blacks and other minorities. And that's one might call it internal colonialism, may not use it, but that's very different from direct physical, military, economic, political control of one country over another country, which is what imperialism was. And these were not small people. I mean, a huge millions of people who are being ruled by a group of 1,000 people, you know, and Britishers, when they ruled over India, they were just few thousands, and they were controlling the destiny of millions of people. So the first point is that there is a progressive dimension to nationalism. The second is that even that nationalism acquires different forms. And again, South Asia is a very interesting example, that the 14th of August 1947, Pakistan was created. 15th of August 1947, India was created. But still huge difference between the two of them, okay? India, on a formal basis, was a secular republic. Pakistan was a theocratic republic. Though the founder of Pakistan did say that the argument of religion as a nation, and Muslims as being a different nation, was purely a tactical move. And once Pakistan has been created, everyone is equal. Of course, it did not succeed like that. But the democratic space which was created in India was hugely more important than the democratic space which was created in Pakistan. Okay, both got independence on the same day. And India, we had workers' movements, peasants' movements, students' movements, tribal movements, very strong Communist Party, even if it was aligned with Moscow and Stalinism. At one point of time, they got 10% of the total vote. And they were able to bring about enormous amount of changes in Indian society, in universities, in media, in the parliament, legislation on labor, human rights, and so on and so forth. Now, all that cannot be forgotten by the fact that now there is a Hindu majoritarian rule in India, and which is oppressing Muslims and other minorities and the tribals. So my attitude is to look at the two-pronged nature, which I would think is a dialectical way of looking at nationalism. Neither to kind of extol its virtues and therefore recognize its limitation, but also to recognize the progressive potentialities of nationalism. Just as an opening statement, but we can discuss more dimensions of that. That's my position on that. Yeah.
Okay, David. David had his hand up. David.
Yes, I wanted to address the issue of white supremacy, at least in U.S. society. I did read Peter Uris's piece where he gets into this, and I think this is really a critical issue now in our struggle in the United States. And there's been so much written about intersectionality and so forth. And a matter of fact, the latest issue I just got from Science and Society is dealing with that whole topic of intersectionality from a Marxist point of view, or several Marxist point of view, let's put it that way. And I just want to kind of emphasize that what I think is the most fruitful analysis is been outlined actually by Victor Wallace in a paper he did for a political science journal, where he talks about the class domination being the cement that brings together all the different forms of oppression. Mm-hmm. And I can share that. I'm sure he wouldn't mind. I can share that PDF. with you, but I'm very impressed with the work of Theodore Allen on this subject. When I was teaching at Howard University, in the last few years, I would ask my students, of course, this is a historically Black university, and virtually all my students were Black, and I asked them point blank, who invented the white race?
God.
Yeah, who invented the white race? They looked at me, I said, what is this white guy talking about?
Alexei?
Is he is he referring to Yaqub in the Nation of Islam theology? Perhaps some of them might have thought that. Okay, but of course I was referring to Ted Allen's book, The Invention of the White Race, and and then we went on. I got into a little bit of what he was saying, and it was so I could see my students being empowered by understanding this, on how white supremacy was born as a form of domination by the ruling class, and of course the more problematic part is to understand how most white people in the United States actually, while they enjoy white skin privilege, in an absolute sense, they would live better without white supremacy. That's the point which needs to be explored and explained. I think it's quite relevant to the theme of our discussions today. And of course, I would think that it takes different forms all over the world. But how was a certain form of oppression born? How did it emerge in society? And how did it then be reproduced in the interests of the ruling class? And I just want to point to something I just read yesterday in the New York Times about the Dalit population in India, who are now rising up, the untouchables, 250 million in India. I didn't realize there was such a large part of the population, but they're rising up against the Modi government because of their oppression. Again, this is a different form of oppression than we exist here, but it seems to be part of, historically, the Indian political economy to preserve that oppression. So that's probably my last intervention today.
Richard.
Thank you.
Yes, I just wanted to clarify, particularly to Pritam, the limitation of my remarks.
Yeah.
Because you felt the sympathy for all of those national liberation movements that I've been involved with all these years. The conclusion that I came to is that creating a national state, a new national state, is not a solution to those very real and important problems of what you could call national oppression, but which is simply the oppression of, for instance, women, sexual oppression, racial oppression when somebody has a different appearance or comes from a different place, ethnic oppression of language groups, and so on. They all have different origins. The origin in America of Black slavery is very, very important and so deeply embedded in our culture, just as in India the caste system is, that there's absolutely no way forward without destroying it, without stepping over its grave, without finding some way to use that to unite all of the oppressed together so that we come and have a different society. So to me, democracy, true democracy, not parliamentary bullshit, and human rights, the rights of all individuals, the rights of all groups. That's fundamental. So speaking of Peter's thesis, I agree with half of it, that that in the United States, the Black struggle for humanity, for recognition, for legal rights, and for respect is revolutionary. And there are moments when race needs to be put against class, because until you've moved away from those questions of race and stop dividing people, there's no way that the class struggle can really emerge. Whereas it was believed by socialists before that if we put the class struggle first and win it, then we'll take care of the women, and we'll take care of the minorities, and so on afterwards. But that never happened.
And that can never happen. It's
right.
Not that it did not happen, it will never happen.
Exactly. So that's why I'm in two places that seem close, but they're not really. I'm saying, yes, we must defend against every form of national oppression, and recognize that, like the Dalits in India that are struggling, that's a subject of revolution. But at the same time, have no illusion that giving them a state or something along those lines is going to be a solution.
Now, let me pose you a question. That when the national movement for independence was emerging in India, or when the struggle of Bangladeshi people against Pakistan oppression was developing, what would a socialist do? Would a socialist do that there is no point in fighting against British imperialism because a new nation state will emerge in India, and nation state is not a solution? Unless we have a socialist revolution which replaces the British imperialism, there is no point in participating in any national struggle to overthrow British imperialism. Similarly, someone in Bangladesh could say that Pakistani Punjabi domination over Bengali people is not acceptable, but what do we do? Should we not participate in the struggle of Bengali people to have their language recognized and to throw away the yoke of Pakistan, or say that unless there is a socialist revolution in Bangladesh, there is no point in fighting Pakistan? Now, my position would be that the socialist fundamentalist position would be wrong, that it will be absolutely revolutionary to say that people in India fighting against British imperialism, even to create an Indian national state. People in Bangladesh fighting against Pakistani oppression, even to create a Bangladeshi nation state, is a progressive struggle. And socialist revolutionaries must participate in that struggle, give a new direction to this, but do not abandon it precisely because it is not a pure socialist struggle.
I agree.
So then, if you agree, then merely then arguing that nation state is not a solution doesn't look like a very robust proposition, because nation state has to emerge. When British imperialism is thrown away, an Indian nation state will emerge. When oppressive Pakistani control over Bangladesh is replaced, a Bangladeshi nation state will emerge. So it's a transitional stage. You can say that once it's created, you need to carry it forward, but it has to be there.
But it's a transition to a new and more solidly based oppression. So I say participate in the movement, but as a socialist, and say that the only solution is to unite with other groups and to be an internationalist and to have the most complete democracy.
Yes, some of the people
and not to ally with groups that are ready to seize the state and use it as a way to maintain oppressive class.
That is purely at the level of argument. It's in terms of actually participating in the struggle. What does it mean? That if demonstrations are being held to overthrow British imperialism, if they are asking that Britain should leave India, we want to have a new nation state, what would you do? Would you say that we are not going to participate in this discussion and struggle because an Indian state will emerge, a nation state will emerge, and that nation state is not going to be progressive?
I would participate with with our own slogans and our own signs and our own political line.
Yes, yes, but not as a counter to the movement which is already there. And to one can say similarly in Vietnam, that there was a struggle against British imperialism, and the Communist Party, even if it's a Stalinist led or Stalinist influenced, was participating in this, where the national question of people of Vietnam was a very important one, along with the socialist orientations. So I think that we should not so easily dismiss that because a new nation state is going to be created, we have nothing to do with that nation state, because that nation state will be also oppressive. Because then ipso facto, you are supporting imperialism there. Then you are becoming an ally of imperialism to continue, because you're opposing the alternative to that imperialism.
It's the case.
Today, that's all the past. The world is filled up with the national states, and there's no new room for new ones, and they're all oppressive. And
so let's historically say what happened in 1947 when British imperialism left India. Was a progressive step or a reactionary step? For me, it was a progressive step.
Here's the thing.
What has happened after that is not a great, and that therefore what happened in 1947 was also a reactionary step. It is not.
That's right. That's right. Very good point.
Can I add some?
Yes. Alexei has joined us.
Yes, I'm sorry for joining you later, and probably I missed some important things, but now I can understand the problem which you are discussing. And I think Pritam is right when he says that at this objective step of economic and social and political development in the world, you can't go without state. The world is not yet ripe to anarchy, to libertarian communism, and so on. And in this sense, I think some Kurdish forces at the present moment makes a big mistake. You know that Öcalan, the leader of the PKK, evolved from Stalinism, Maoism, to a kind of anarchism. And now I think because of that, because of his personal cult is not yet overcome in these Kurdish political groups and movement, his conception borrowed from Bookchin is dominated. And they don't have a clear slogan of united, independent, democratic Kurdistan, the Kurdish state. They have very vague and abstract conception of federation, of communes, and so on and so forth. And this is an obstacle. This is an obstacle for liberation, not only of Kurdish people, but of the Middle East itself. The program must be realistic. And at the same time, I think Richard is absolutely right when he says that the national state can take completely different forms, and some kind of national state can be absolutely reactionary, much more reactionary than imperialist empire with colonies, much more oppressive, much more terroristic. No, let's say about, I don't know, Cambodia or Zimbabwe. Everything depends on the nature of the state and the nature of national liberation movements. The state must be absolutely democratic. We can't support those national liberation movements which produce the slogan of the national liberation, but don't say clearly that they are in favor of absolute democracy and human rights and so on and so forth. Only on this condition, this national liberation movement deserves support. And there's another thing is that in the present world, the world of globalization, the objective tendency of development is, of course, for overcoming the division in the national states. And this must be also understood, and I think Richard is correct when he says that the objective tendency develops in this direction. And if the new leaders of the state emerging from the collapse of colonial empires they don't clearly understand this development, this vector of development. It's also a danger. And we can see this, for instance, now in Ukraine, where the revolution of Maidan had an anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist character to put an end to the old tradition of dependence over Russia, the former colonial ruler. And also it has a democratic and pro-European tendency. But at the same time, it had a tendency of this crude nationalism. The Ukrainian nationalists who don't understand that the revolution was pro-European, was internationalist, democratic, but not to create the fortress Ukraine. Yes, and now in Ukraine, the progressive socialist democratic forces, they should, and they actually fighting for against two fronts. One front is the reactionary restorationist forces supported from Russia, and another front is this Ukrainian nationalists who don't understand the objective nature of development toward Ukraine, toward Europe, toward European and then world unity. As socialists put it before, United States of Europe. That's our position. That's what Trotsky and Kautsky and all these people defended. I think that the contemporary socialists, they should reclaim this slogan and use it in their political struggle.
Thank you.
Now, just to play devil's advocate here, if you pose the slogan or the concept of the United States of Europe, you're still advocating states, and that's where yes. Richard's point comes back in. You know, to what extent, how can we begin to find ways to supersede the nation state form as a form of social organization and as a means of liberation? It's very difficult because we're talking about it's really about uneven and combined development and the unevenness of the world in which, you know, we, on the one hand, we have this very globalized social formation of international capitalism. And on the other hand, we have peoples in particular locales and geographical zones that are still, you know, not free even at the level of their nation or ethnicity, and they're, you know, oppressed as such. So they're fighting to establish some kind of state form that would defend their own rights and humanity. And it's not warranted to simply jump over that, as Alexei was pointing out in the case of Kurdistan. You know, however much we admire the people of you know, the Kurds in Syria for trying to, you know, establish democratic forms of collaboration on the ground in workers' councils and this kind of Murray Bookchin political ecology, social ecology, communal forms, that is in some ways trying to leap over a contradiction that really exists in the world, and that the absence of a unified national Kurdish state that would defend the Kurds against all of their different oppressors, from Syria to Turkey to Iran to Iraq and so on. So not that I'm presenting any solution to this. I'm just trying to, you know, elaborate on what Alexei and Richard have been saying about the, you know, the contradictions and the challenges that people face, and particularly people who are involved in or in situations that are still very fraught with all of these national and ethnic and religious contradictions and tensions, and trying to find a way forward that is solidaristic and yet addresses the particular oppressions of these different groups of people.
I mean, one way which comes to my mind about overcoming this dual contradiction or dual problem that if you do not have an alternative mode of governance in mind, then everything that fizzles out. And Lexi's example of Kurdish struggle is very good one, because this anarchist view that we just get together into different communes is actually leading to, wasting the combined struggle of the Kurdish people. And they must have a certain vision of an alternative form of governance, which will have to be some kind of a Kurdish national state. So that's one. Secondly, to overcome the other problem, that when that nation state emerges, it does not become oppressive. The process of involvement in the struggle is very important. That when how decisions are being taken, what kind of committees are being formed, what kind of organizations are being formed, who are the office bearers being selected, are they being selected democratically? Therefore, you are creating the building blocks of creating a democratic national state. And my argument is the same, which I was talking about eco-socialism. Similarly, democratic reforms under capitalism has the same example, that you want to replace capitalism by socialism. You also create more democratic space. Similarly, if you want to replace dirty capitalism with green socialism, you also fight for green reforms within capitalism. So similarly, in the national struggle, when you are fighting against an oppressive nationality, whether it's imperialist or a dominant nationality within a multinational state, you have to posit an alternative form of governance, which is a state as a transitional phase. But that state can become democratic. It doesn't necessarily have to be oppressive if from the very beginning the process of involvement in that state creates democratic structures.
Richard has his hand up. I wonder if Conrad has anything to contribute to this particular conversation. An interesting thing has unfolded here, because while we were all discussing one thing verbally, several of us have also been chatting about an entirely different topic, but I'm trying to move back and forth, and maybe we can reconverge on the central point here.
Sure. I just would say briefly, and I think this is maybe a bit of a digression, but with respect to the question of different struggles and kind of different modes of struggle, talking about feminism and race and class and things like that, I think it's a little bit. I think someone was talking here about class struggle as kind of the cement that unites all of these different forms of struggle. But to me, I think we have to be a little bit careful because I think that you would understand class struggle, I think, as emerging at the level where there was real class discrepancy. And if we look at Marx's kind of the anthropology that's developed with Marx and Engels in the origin, or Engels in the origin of family, private property, and the state. Part of the function of such a text is to show that the idea of social class only begins to exist once you have, for example, the creation of surpluses in agriculture and the appropriation of that and the installation of patriarchy. So I know in Reading Capital, Etienne Balibar has an essay, and he talks about the need to think in terms of the structure and dominance, right? So to think of class struggle as being a corollary, of the development of society based on a common form of value, and the cultivation of a kind of market economy. Engels, of course, in the origin of family, private property, and the state, even says that the distinction between men and women, right, the oppression of women is the kind of the germ of all subsequent class struggle. That is the first and kind of inceptive, profound, unequal division. So again, I think one thing, and sometimes in kind of neo-Marxist discourse, I'm thinking about Jacobin. I think there's a certain compulsion here with Verso. There's sometimes, I think when you think, oh, well, class struggle, that's all there is, that's all there ever was, as a socioeconomic reality, it can be very dismissive of other things. And I know the feminist Marxist Katerina Kolozova, she said that every time, Jacobin says liberal feminism, they really just mean feminism. The two terms become almost indissociable at the level where anything that emphasizes anything apart from the primacy of economic class struggle is viewed suspiciously. Right? I think we need to be more historically and philosophically sophisticated than that, right? Than just kind of having this metaphysical basis and saying that's it.
Can I speak before Richard? I'll be very
yes.
Thank you, comrade in Montpellier. Very interesting point, Conrad. I just want to address a couple of points here that were just made. How do we transcend the challenge of real existing states in the world? Well, I think we need a dimension in class struggle, and I look at class struggle as being multidimensional and transnational. And we're dealing with the world today. So we need to look to create a global subject that has the capacity to intervene, not to replace, but to intervene in national struggles. And particularly because we're confronting global challenges which impact all of humanity, like climate change, the threat of nuclear war, and so forth. We need a powerful transnational subject that intervenes politically in every nation, but not to replace the national struggle. Then the other point is regarding class struggle itself in Marxist theory. And again, I will invoke, I think, is a very powerful concept regarding the valorization of labor power and how class struggle intervenes in the valorization of labor power under capitalism. And again, and it has so many ramifications. And again, Michael Leibowitz has elaborated on this and others. And this again resonates with previous points regarding class struggle in real existing capitalism, and how we relate this to strategy and so on. But it really kind of, for me, it unfolds directly from the heart of capitalist exploitation of labor power, and how we need to explore all of the dimensions that this takes place. I'm not in any way reducing forms of oppression to class exploitation, but how they intersect and how they reproduce the hegemony of the ruling class in capitalism. So that was my quick point. Thank you, Richard, for bearing with me, as usual.
Well, it was a pleasure, because I would have wanted to make the same point myself. I'd like to just respond with some specifics, okay? Talking about the Kurds, I don't know what the solution is for the Kurds, although I'm very sympathetic to what they're trying to do. And I only want to point out is that there are three Kurdistans competing, so to speak, and that the Iraqi Kurdistan, the Peshmerga, which did succeed in gaining pretty much not total statehood, but close to it, and is in a struggle with Iraq, has not been forced into it or something like it, does not have very good support or relations with the Kurds that are fighting and listening to Öcalan and reading Murray Bookchin. So this is a very complex thing. And I don't know, they've tried, those Kurds, to ally with everybody, and sometimes unscrupulously. But when you're a people that's an oppressed people and struggling for mere survival, since clearly the idea is that they should be exterminated or ethnically cleansed out of existence, I don't know what else to say, except that the world, which is the state system, the capitalist state system, is a system. And that when we try to talk about the atoms in the system, when they're connected into an object, right? An historical thing. Today's world state system, which is a relatively new phenomenon, and which has made migration, which is a age-old human phenomenon, something that is impossible. I see the world state system as what in biology we call a semi-permeable membrane. That is to say, it's a web in which some things can pass through it and other things can't. What passes through it is international capital. There's practically no place where capital of any nation can't penetrate and begin to create imperialist relations. For example, China in US's backdoor in Latin America and in France's backdoor in Africa. And the Chinese may prove to be more successful in those places than recently the old imperialists. But the point, all right, so it is a system, and it is so totally confining. It's like everybody has to be a member of a crew of a tank, and all of those tanks are out shooting at other tanks, or groups of them, because we have an imperialist system which is as full of conflicts as it was in Europe on the eve of World War I, with medium-sized regional imperialisms like the Iranians and the Saudis and so on, and the Turks, and then bigger imperialisms, and then so on. Now, the United States of Europe was a dream which I share, and I've never put down any of those old socialist ideas. But I live in the United States of Europe. It gave itself the name of the European Union, but it was pretty much the same thing. It now has, well, how many nations? 23 nations in Europe. Okay. Now, since I've lived here for the last 20-odd years, I have seen the German banks and the world bankers use salami tactics, destroying the hard-won gains of the proletariats in every one of those states. They've all been, look at the most recent one, Greece, okay? Destroyed Greece, sold them no good stocks, made them borrow stuff, locked them into debt, usury, everything terrible about it, destroyed every form of struggle there, taking away every welfare and so on, and nobody's doing anything about it in Europe. Neither the Second International nor the Third International, neither the socialists nor the communists ever did anything. The same thing they're doing in Ireland, they did it in Spain, they do it in Portugal. With Macron, they're trying to do it in France. What is they trying to do? Destroy the post-World War II, generally democratic, generally social democratic, new social contract with the capitalist class. That the workers would be allowed to live, that they'd have a certain amount of consumer goods, that they'd have a certain amount of freedom, and that they wouldn't have to worry about working until they drop or starving into old age. Right now, France and Germany are practically the last countries that have those, and you see what kind of struggle is going on here. Well, I could turn and say to these French strikers, where were you when they did the same to the Greeks? You know, how is it that there hasn't been, with all of these organizations that call themselves internationals, any kind of cross-border struggle? Now, in the United States, we also have states. Of course, they're mini states because they're part of a federation, and there's a federal government over them. But you know, that isn't such a bad idea. Montesquieu thought of it, and he was no dummy. But the point I'm trying to make is this. In the last month, we have seen for the first time strikes leaping across state lines, strikes breaking down the barriers that unions put up to keep workers from uniting and from having solidarity. So that in West Virginia, the teachers were able to include the bus drivers and the cooks in the school and the janitors, and finally all the public employees, in their demands. And they went straight to the source of power, the government, the governor and the legislature, and they negotiated in force because they were able to overcome these artificial lines. Okay, artificial lines. Unions, they only exist as creatures of the state. The French union leaders are paid by the state. The American union leaders have a law that allows them to get the dues and everything as long as they obey the state. And solidarity strikes are forbidden by this law. So the law that establishes unions in the United States is the anti-solidarity law, known as the Taft-Hartley Act. And there's no way that they, within these state things, that the class struggle can develop internationally. So that's when I look at the United States of Europe. I'd like to see more of the United Workers of Europe and the divided democracy of Europe and a European Union that wasn't only for the benefit of bankers and capitalists. This is the problem, and I can't see that any solution is possible unless we break out of and break up the world state system. Because I've never seen a policeman come and defend strikers when scabs came up with sticks and brass knuckles. You know what I'm saying? The state is always on the side of capital against labor. That is its function. We can have governments, we can have regions, we can have autonomy, we can have all kinds of mixtures, as was under oppressive conditions possible in the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had certain positive characteristics, even though it was oppressive. So, but, you know, I don't know. It's true, I can't imagine what the form would take. The form would take federations of people uniting, but it would have to be across state lines, whether the state is the line between West Virginia and Arkansas and Oklahoma. It's happening, so it can happen. And maybe the internet universe is what makes it possible for such things to happen.
One of the ironies, if I can, of what you suggest, of what you were discussing, Richard, I just point this out because it's funny, is that one of the only, you know, high-profile French figures that came and spoke in support of Greece, you know, when Germany was kind of, you know, inflicting this horrific regimen on the country, was Macron, uncharacteristically and ironically, who proved. So funny detail. And this was noted by Yanis Varoufakis. I want to say about Europe, it seems to me, and we have some really good resources for understanding Europe in the work of Yanis Varoufakis, who was previously with Syriza, also in some of the ideas of Dominique Strauss-Kahn before his unceremonious collapse. You know, I mean, the basic problem, and Keynes says this in 44 in Bretton Woods, I mean, the basic problem is, you know, you can't have a single currency without economic equality, right? And you get a country like Greece and the situation they're in, and things are fine until there's a recession. But when there's a recession, if you can't devalue your currency, I mean, the only thing, maybe you know this, but I'm just for everyone, the only thing you can do is go to a wealthier country and say, can you help us out? And ideally, you would have never been in that discrepant situation in the first place because there would have been economic equality. And if that country says, as Germany does, we'll give you, you know, €5 with one hand, we're going to take away €5 with the other, well, you're totally fucked, right? And, you know, in Greece, it's a catastrophe. It's a whole generation that's lost. Dominique Strauss-Kahn, I think, proposed what would have been the best idea. And he's just borrowing the idea from Keynes, but it was the idea of an SRM, or a surplus recycling mechanism. So the idea that all countries in Europe that accrue trade surpluses, and we know Germany's quite notorious for this, it's kind of neo-mercantilism, would be required in such a mechanism to reinvest, and I say invest, not necessarily give, but reinvest their surpluses in the poor member states, right? Thus eventually creating the conditions that are conducive to actually having a currency.
I think what Richard described is the capitalist offensive and the class struggle, and the question arises, what are the conditions more favorable for class struggle against capitalist offensive? Is it a system of national states in Europe, or it's, let's say, capitalist European Union? I think the answer is very simple. Even in this present form, European Union is much better and much favorable for workers and class struggle than in the period when peoples of Europe were divided by national borders, the national conflicts, contradictions, national bureaucracies, and so on. And of course, we should try to develop this system and democratize this system and make it more social, but not by just saying that European Union has no value at all and let's destroy it and go back. No, only forward, not back. And another thing, Richard says that he lives in European Union, he sees it from inside, but I can look at the problem from outside. And I think that even in present form, European Union is still attractive for people, for instance, in Eastern Europe, post-Soviet states, which want to become a part of this united Europe, even in this present sense. Why? Because there are, first of all, human rights, democratic and social standards, which are more superior than outside the European Union. The level of life, also the same, and the simple fact that there is no national divisions, actually, no possibility of wars between European countries, and France and Germany, you can't imagine them fighting against each other. No occupations, no ethnic cleansing. So I think this you should also understand. We all understand that the European Union is a capitalist formation, and there is a capitalist offensive, and there is a lack of democracy. But at the same time, the European Union is an achievement also by the workers' movement and citizens' movement. And the European Union, if it's joined by other countries, it can provide other peoples opportunity to join the international, inter-European struggle for the better future. That's my point.
I'm not very sure, Alexei, that European Union is a product of working class struggles. The idea of European Union is more German and French conception to begin with, and it was a conception of the big monopoly capital, big European capital who wanted to have access to the European capital without any hindrances. So the vision of European Union wasn't a product of working class struggles wanted to be, organized on a European level. It was more a bourgeois conception and motivated by the interests of market penetration and market access by big European capital. That's one point. Secondly, I'm not sure that being a part of European Union for any country in the European Union is necessarily a progressive step. As Conrad has mentioned about Greece, at many places, I think for people of Greece, leaving European Union was more progressive. Not to be subordinated to the European discipline, which meant mainly German discipline. And they were being forced into it. That's why there was a split in Syria. And Eurofocus came out of it because he did not agree with the president. So I think that the situation is more complex than simply saying that it is a progressive and historically favorable thing, that there are chinks within that, there are contradictions within that, there are tensions within that, and there are some of the steps which European Union does is actually not progressive, and especially in the case of Greece, but in many ways the discipline which they were imposing on Ireland and Portugal, etc. Certainly, I mean, Portugal in some sense is a good example, and maybe at some stage we need to discuss the Portuguese example, because the left has not paid enough attention to the Portuguese struggle, how they have been able to overcome sectarianism, the Trotskyists, the Maoists, and the pro-Moscow and Stalinists and the Greens. They have been able to come together, and the project which they have kind of projected, they have neither defied the European Union nor they have actually. But that's a separate topic. But the main point I was wanting to make is that we have to be little careful in presenting European Union as a product of working class struggles.
Yes, but what about the idea of the socialist movement of 19th century, which I mentioned before, United States of Europe? This was an official position of the workers and socialist movement. And when at that time, the ruling classes, the capitalists and bureaucrats were against this because they defended their national sovereignty as some kind of principal idea. And also, if we look at the stages of development of European unity, we also find that the left-wing forces and trade union movement was in favor of that, abandoned borders, abandoned this kind of control over people, abandoned these national bureaucracies. Of course, I completely agree that European Union is not a purely progressive and so on and so forth. It's a contradictory phenomenon and ruled, of course, by the dominant classes. There's no problem with that. But we should understand how to go forward, not back. For Greece and Portugal to become again the national states would be a step back, not forward, even for them.
Mm.
Well, certain section of the left are actually arguing for this, that they should leave European Union.
I'd just like to raise the question of what we mean when we use the word progressive, because I avoid it, because I think that progress, the myth of progress, is one of those forms of utopian ideology that I believe, if I understand him, which I often don't, Sam was making fun of. I'm never sure with Sam when he's quite ironic. But for instance, the free market is clearly a utopia. It's an ideology which serves as a mask for monopolization and using the state system to support certain industries and to create certain markets, okay? So, and progress has been used in a neo-Darwinian sense of it's always industrialization and more science and so on. And it has often led certainly to ecological disaster and very often to greater oppression. So to say that something is progressive, what do we mean? You, for instance, said that the founding of India and of Pakistan, but to a lesser extent, was progressive in the context of the British Empire. And it's hard to argue with that, except to my thought that went into my head was, historians will decide whether that's true or false in a century. That is to say, in 2118, because we don't know what's historical until we know what develops out of the next phase and the next phase after that. And the same thing, yes, there are certainly progressive aspects, or positive, let's say positive, okay? Positive aspects that France and Europe, France and Germany are not fighting over their border, because what's in their border is coal on one side and iron on the other. And they fought three wars before they finally sat down, and the coal barons and the iron barons of France and Germany created the beginnings of the European Union, which was the coal and steel. You were referring to that because you know that well because of your economic studies. So that was a very good answer to what Alexei says. So that's certainly positive that they're not killing each other. But what does progressive mean when the world is leading to self-destruction through all of these successful forms of relative progress? It's hard for me to think that way, and I prefer maybe to think of a fantasy of what could be different, because I can't see the world state system as we know it and the progresses we've experienced as leading to anything that
my view, progress is in two dimensions. One from the viewpoint of ecology and one without ecology. And from an ecological point of view, we will discuss that issue of progress in a different way. But let me say why I would call 1947 Indian state, even if it's a national state, is a progressive compared with British rule over India. Number one, the government which was going to be elected after 47 was based on a universal franchise. For the first time, every adult male, female in India had the right to vote, which is one progressive. Number two, there was labor legislation that workers have the rights to form trade unions, that there are fixed numbers of work, that workers have rights to have leave. Number two. Number three, that the country is going to be reorganized on a different platform of a linguistic basis, that people carry on their business in their own mother tongue. English is not imposed on them. English is not their language. So people can carry day-to-day activities in Bengali or Punjabi or in Tamil and so on and so forth. That for me is a progressive step. And the third, that even if people are communists, they have the right to form government. So in India, for the first time in 1949, we had a democratically elected communist government in Kerala. And that is for the first time in the history of the world that communists come to power. They were all behind prisons by the Nehruvian government. The people chose them. And once they chose them, they had to be released from prison and they formed the government. For me, that is a progressive. So things like that, combined together to me means progress. But that is very different from the way progress is used these days, which is without ecology. Progress is used in terms of increase in GDP, and we all who know about ecology know that actually that kind of progress is actually destructive of the environment, and therefore we need to have a new conception of progress. But I want to clarify about the 47, that why I would think that was progress.
Pritam, I embrace everything you said, and you said it with great eloquence and with great feeling. But the question that is still in the back of my mind is, what if Indians had fought for and won democracy and the right to use their language and all the rest of those things, and women's right to vote, without declaring a new nation? Because by declaring a new nation,
what
suddenly...
would they call them? What would they call themselves? When the British left, what would they call themselves?
Canada.
Sorry?
Canada.
Canada?
Canada didn't leave the British Empire and had internal democracy. What if, instead of fighting for a free nation, they had fought for human rights, women's rights, democracy rights, trade union rights, language rights, without raising...
Which government will come to power? The question was whether India is ruled by a governor general appointed by the British, or India is ruled by an Indian who's elected by votes. Which one would be progressive? The second one would be progressive.
India elected by votes.
Yes, by votes by the Indian people, right. and that is a...
What if the British could have been made to concede that?
But why would British concession to Indians is more progressive than Indians actually having the right to form their own government?
I don't know, but it seems to me that if you could achieve those same goals, which were only partially achieved, and now things have moved in a reactionary sense,
but
without raising
Canada too.
What?
Why bring Canada into the conversation at all? Canada is a capitalist state. Canada is an imperialist nation state. Canada oppresses its domestic national minorities and indigenous peoples. It did not, nothing was better about Canada as opposed to India. I just don't get it.
That's a very good point. Yeah.
What Canada has to do with it.
Yeah, I made something up that wasn't very smart.
I will forgive you.
that the legal fact of independence and an army and all the rest of it.
Which Canada has.
Oh, which Canada has. Okay, it was a bad example.
Well, technically our head of state is the Queen, so.
There you go. That's about the only difference, I think.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Alexei.
Yeah, I think that I disagree completely with Richard on this problem of progress. I think that the progress is the basic idea of history, of materialist understanding of history. If you abandon the idea of progress, you abandon Marxism, you abandon all this, yes, exactly. You abandon all this tradition of thought, which goes through the Enlightenment, through Hegel, Marx, and so on. And the basic idea of materialist understanding of history, of historical materialism, is that the moving force of history is the development of productive forces. Productive forces produce changes in social structure, a succession of social economic formations that has results in intellectual and political infrastructure and so on. And through this dynamic, humanity progresses, advances towards the realm of freedom, toward communism. How you can abandon this basic idea? And this idea not only just a product of the mind, but I think it's proven by the whole historical development. We see this progressive development through ages. What does it mean to progress? Progress means, first of all, that people become more wealthy, people become more free. People have better positions to develop themselves. That's truth. You can't say that it's not so. Even from the point of view of ecology, let's compare the situation in the mid-19th century in England and London and today London. You could not even breathe because of the ecological situation at the period of industrialization. Now you don't have this situation in England. You can have this situation in China, but not in England. And this is because England is more developed than China. Also the ABC of Marxism. And Richard says that the humanity goes to self-destruction. Yes, I think, of course, there is a danger of self-destruction in ecological terms. But the law of history is that the humanity finds answers to challenges. Again, the example from the mid-19th century Britain. At that time, people said that Britain is going to ecological disaster because there are too many horses in the capital of England, and horses produce tons of excrements. And these excrements will blow and the people will be drowned in this excrement. What happened? Where are these excrements? So technological development under social control and democratic control is able to solve ecological problems. And this is also a dimension of progressive development.
I just want to add, I'm generally in agreement with what you just said. I just want to say that I think that when you talk about, achieving a good quality of life or something like this, I think that, it's not, for me anyway, it's not so much, when we talk about progress, it's not so much an empirical benchmark. I mean, I think that what progress refers to, in this sort of leftist tradition, if we look at Hegel, if we look at Marx, is the resolution of contradiction. And Marx, to some extent, and Hegel, that's taken up on a material basis. The problem of ecology, for me, doesn't stand outside of that. Like if you look at what Marx is discussing in Capital, it's always been the case that there's a contradiction generated between the drive to produce capital, right, and the discontents of that, right? So I think that the mission of saving the environment, as it were, is entirely consistent with other, let's say, more historical efforts to recognize the contradiction that's like this chasm, right, and this contradiction that's imposed by capital. Of course, today these environmental projects we can say are progressive because we recognize that that's something we have to do, right? That's a problem facing us. It's a contradiction we have to resolve. As Marx says, man only sets goals for himself he's capable of achieving. So, also, for something to be registered, regardless of its material basis, for something to be registered as a problem and for us to pursue its resolution, that's also an epistemological process, right? A material epistemological process, if you will. But yeah, I mean, by no means. So I stress the element of the resolution of contradiction, you know, in the material domain, rather than a more empirical benchmark, like about creating quality of life or something. But I am completely in agreement that I think there is a way, certainly, to maintain this concept of progress.
Richard, do you want to wrap this up for us? It's after 1.
Okay. I don't believe that history has laws. I learned from Marx that in the class struggle, one side or the other can win, or there can be stasis, or there can be the mutual destruction of both classes. So there's no straight line. And as far as progress is concerned, when in 1842, the average height of the British person had gone down from 5'9" to 5'3", and that the children were working and people were living in hovels and all of the things like that, that certainly wasn't progress. So yes, it's dialectical. The fact that the working class was able to react to that extreme oppression that came in with technology being monopolized by greedy capitalists led to more democracy, which led to eventually the cleaning up of London. By the way, the smog didn't end till after World War II, and it ended because they stopped using coal and started using other fuels, including electricity. But so I'm very, very weary of, scared of the word progress, because basically what it means is whatever before that wasn't good, and whatever came after that was better. And it isn't the case. Today at the universities, we were having a discussion, and it turned out that in France, in the Middle Ages, they had 180 holidays in the year. Between the church, they were like half the days were feast days. So, you know, they didn't need to have too many strikes. What I'm saying is that it's the struggle that counts, and it's the content of the struggle: democracy, solidarity, cooperation, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you on this, on the question of progress, that not necessarily everything in the present is progressive compared with the past. And from an ecological point of view, I feel it all the more, because the theory of historical materialism has this linear path that every successive mode of production is superior to the previous mode of production, and therefore capitalism is superior to feudalism, feudalism to slavery, and so on and so forth, and socialism will be superior to capitalism. In the realm of ecology, I find many aspects of pre-capitalist modes of production progressive than they are in capitalism. Capitalism ecologically more destructive of ecology. Therefore, I would actually like to revise theory of historical materialism in the light of ecology, but that's only a thought at this moment, not fully worked it out. And I don't think that there's a linear process of progress.
It doesn't need to be revised. Marx was the one who pointed out that if the British had taken the horse manure that supposedly was drowning them and taking it back into the fields and healing the rift between town and country so that they were pouring it into the Thames River instead of bringing it back to, and then importing from Chile tons of guano and so on. I mean, it's completely crazy the way that we think of progress. I just want to say that, and I know we're going on, but I want to say, it seems to me that if we look again at the origin of family, private property in the state, which I brought up before, there's a very extensive recognition by Engels that was apparently endorsed by Marx of a lot of the salient advantages associated with modes of production that were earlier, right? So I don't necessarily purchase this idea that it's as simple as that there's this sort of, and certainly I think that's problematized in Marx and Engels' later work. I don't think there's this simple, oh, this is superior to this. You know, I think they do actually have a more nuanced understanding of these things. But also, I mean, dialectically, this idea that, again, like there are people, sure, there's this foundationalist idea of progress.
right? You know, in Western metaphysical history, and you see it trotted out, you know, in media and journalism all over. It's very common, but that's not a dialectical conception, right? And I think that a dialectical conception, I mean, we know that it's always based on the recapitulation of the past in a certain way. I mean, in a very simple formulation, you know, primitive communism, you know, more developed modes of production, full communism, right? To give a very sort of vulgar example. But the point is that, you know, there is no, you know, this is not, and certainly in Hegel, and I don't think in Marx, this is not some kind of linear teleology that we're looking at. So I think we have to kind of separate out the concept of progress as it's used in sort of a vulgar and popular way, and the much more nuanced conception that we have, you know, in kind of a dialectical context.
Hey, this has been a great discussion. I really enjoyed this with you.
Yeah, I think we're out of time, so I at least have to go.
Yeah, I think so. It's a good idea to.
We have our listserv. We have Future Historians Google group. We have the wiki. We have ways to communicate, and we should reconvene with. Not sure what our topic will be, but we'll reconvene in 2 weeks. And in the meantime, keep talking. Richard, do you have anything else to say?
Thank you. Very rich discussion today. Thank you.
Thomas, why not to organize a Future Historians group on Facebook?
It's a good idea.
I think we have one.
Oh.
Probably a page, not a group.
Yeah, I think we need a group. A group is, Richard and I have talked about this in the past. I think a group is a better way to manage it. So we'll figure that out. But
where we can reach more people.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, the page is more static, and the group concept is much more conducive to conversations and discussions.
Okay.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So we'll see about doing that. Richard?
Tim is working on that, so we'll get him going on that.
Okay, so we'll see you in 2 weeks, everyone. Thanks very much.
See you guys in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Great to see you again.
Yeah, great seeing you. Yeah. Bye, Fred.
Okay, bye-bye. I'll be on here for a moment or two longer to get everything shut down. So take care.